The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Raven's Hollow Palace as Princess Catherine walked through the grand hallways, her footsteps echoing in the unusual silence. Something felt different today, though she couldn't place what it was. The servants moved with hushed whispers, their eyes avoiding hers when she passed. Even the usually cheerful kitchen staff seemed subdued as they prepared the morning meal. Prince William had left early for his weekly meeting with the royal council, kissing her goodbye as he always did. But there had been something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. A weight, perhaps, or a shadow of concern that he tried to hide behind his warm smile. Catherine had learned to read the subtle changes in her husband's expressions over their 7 years of marriage. As the future king of Aldoria, William carried burdens that most people couldn't imagine. The palace felt too quiet for a Tuesday morning. Usually, the sounds of groundskeepers tending the gardens, maids chattering as they cleaned, and the distant clatter of kitchen preparations would create a comfortable symphony of daily life. Today, that symphony was replaced by an eerie stillness that made Catherine's skin prickle with unease. She made her way to the morning room where breakfast was typically served, expecting to find the familiar sight of fresh flowers and perfectly set china. Instead, she found Margaret, the head housekeeper, standing by the window with tears streaming down her weathered face. The older woman had served the royal family for 30 years and had never shown such emotion in Catherine's presence. "Margaret, what's wrong?" Catherine asked gently, moving closer to the woman who had become like a mother figure to her since she'd married into the royal family. The housekeeper turned, her usually composed demeanor completely shattered. "Your Highness," Margaret's voice cracked as she spoke, "I don't know how to tell you this. The king, His Majesty." She couldn't finish the sentence, her hands shaking as she twisted her apron between her fingers. Catherine's heart began to race. King Edmund, William's father, had been in perfect health just days ago when they'd shared dinner together. He'd been laughing at her stories about their recent visit to the children's hospital, his eyes twinkling with the same warmth that William had inherited. There had been no signs of illness, no indication that anything was wrong. "What about the king, Margaret? Please, you're frightening me." The housekeeper took a shuddering breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He passed in his sleep, Your Highness. The royal physician found him this morning when he didn't appear for his usual morning walk. They say his heart simply stopped." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She felt her knees weaken and reached for the nearest chair to steady herself. King Edmund, the man who had welcomed her into the family with open arms, who had taught her about royal protocol with patience and humor, who had been more of a father to her than her own distant parent had ever been, was gone. "Where is William?" she whispered, her mind immediately going to her husband. How was he handling this devastating news? As the crown prince, he would now become king, a responsibility he had been preparing for his entire life, but had hoped wouldn't come for many more years. "His Royal Highness is in the king's study with the Prime Minister and the Archbishop," Margaret replied, her voice still thick with emotion. "They've been there for over an hour, making arrangements." Catherine felt a chill run through her body that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Arrangements. The word seemed so clinical, so inadequate for describing the monumental changes that would now sweep through their lives. William was no longer the crown prince. He was the king of Aldoria, ruler of 8 million people, guardian of centuries of tradition and history. She thought of their children, Prince Alexander, who was only 5 years old, and little Princess Isabella, barely 3. They were too young to understand death, too innocent to grasp that their grandfather, who had been reading them bedtime stories just last week, would never visit their nursery again. How do you explain to children that the man who lifted them onto his shoulders and taught them to feed the palace swans was never coming back? The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke through her thoughts. Heavy, measured steps that she recognized immediately. William appeared in the doorway, and Catherine's heart broke at the sight of him. His usually straight shoulders were slightly slumped, his face pale and drawn. The weight of the crown was already visible in his posture, even though the formal coronation wouldn't happen for months. Their eyes met across the room, and, in that moment, no words were necessary. She could see the grief, the shock, and the overwhelming burden of responsibility all warring in his expression. Without hesitation, Catherine crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, feeling him tremble slightly as he held her close. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against his shoulder, feeling his silent tears dampen her hair. They stood together in the morning room, holding each other as the reality of their new world began to settle around them like a heavy blanket. Outside, She could hear the distant sound of bells beginning to toll across the kingdom, announcing the death of a beloved king and the birth of a new reign. The sound seemed to echo through the palace walls, a solemn reminder that their private grief would soon become public mourning. William pulled back slightly, his hands cupping her face as he looked into her eyes. "Everything changes now, Catherine," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Everything we planned, everything we hoped for our family, it all changes." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Their children would grow up differently now, under the intense scrutiny that came with being the immediate heirs to the throne. Their marriage, their privacy, their very lives would be subject to public examination in ways they had only begun to experience as second in line to the throne. But, looking into her husband's eyes, Catherine felt something strengthen inside her. They would face this together, just as they had faced every challenge in their marriage. The crown might be heavy, but they would share its weight. "We'll get through this," she said firmly, her hands covering his. "Together. Your father raised you to be ready for this moment, even if it came sooner than anyone wanted. You'll be a wonderful king, William. I believe that with all my heart." The bells continued to toll across Aldoria, their mournful song carrying the news to every corner of the kingdom. In the palace, staff members went about their duties with red eyes and hushed voices, beginning the complex preparations that would transform the home of a crown prince into the residence of a reigning monarch. As Catherine stood with her husband in the morning room, where they had shared so many happy breakfasts with King Edmund, she realized that this was the last moment of their old life. Tomorrow would bring official announcements, protocol meetings, and the beginning of William's reign. Tonight, they would mourn a father, a grandfather, and a king who had left them too soon. The news spread through the kingdom like wildfire, carried by news broadcasts, social media, and word of mouth from neighbor to neighbor. By noon, thousands of people had begun gathering outside the palace gates, many carrying flowers, others simply standing in respectful silence. The sight from the palace windows was both heartwarming and overwhelming, a sea of citizens united in grief for their beloved King Edmund. Catherine found herself drawn to the window repeatedly throughout the day, watching as the crowd continued to grow. Elderly people who remembered Edmund's coronation 40 years ago stood beside young families with children who had only known him as the kind grandfather figure who appeared at national celebrations. The diversity of the mourners reflected Edmund's impact on every corner of Aldorian society. "Look at them all," William said quietly, joining her at the window. He had changed from his casual morning clothes into a formal black suit, preparing for the series of official meetings that would continue throughout the day. Dark circles under his eyes revealed the sleepless night that lay ahead. "Your father was deeply loved," Catherine replied, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Look how they've come to honor him." Among the crowd, she could see people of all ages sharing memories, comforting strangers, and laying flowers in neat piles along the palace fence. Some had brought photographs of moments when they had met King Edmund during his many public appearances at hospital openings, school visits, charity events, and community celebrations. Others held handmade signs with messages of gratitude for his decades of service. The children's nanny, Mrs. Harrison, had done her best to explain the situation to 5-year-old Prince Alexander and 3-year-old Princess Isabella, but the concept of death remained difficult for such young minds to grasp. Alexander kept asking when Grandpapa would come to read him stories again, while Isabella searched every room expecting to find the king hiding in one of their favorite games of hide and seek. "Mama, why is everyone so sad?" Alexander asked as he tugged at Catherine's dress. His innocent blue eyes, so much like his father's, looked up at her with confusion. Did Grandpapa do something wrong? Catherine knelt down to Alexander's level, searching for words that a 5-year-old could understand. "No, sweetheart. Grandpapa didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes, when people get older, their bodies get very tired and they have to go to sleep forever. Grandpapa went to sleep last night and won't wake up anymore. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love us." "But I want him to wake up," Alexander said, his lower lip beginning to tremble. "I made him a drawing of a dragon, and I wanted to show him." Isabella, not fully understanding the conversation but sensing the sadness around her, began to cry simply because everyone else seemed upset. Catherine gathered both children in her arms, holding them close as she felt her own tears threaten to spill over again. William watched his family from across the room, his heart breaking not just for the loss of his father, but for the childhood innocence his children were beginning to lose. At 5 and 3, They were too young to understand the full implications of their grandfather's death, that they were now one step closer to the throne, that their lives would become even more structured and public, that the carefree days of their early childhood were coming to an end. The first official meeting of the new reign took place in the king's study, a room that still smelled of Edmund's favorite pipe tobacco and leather-bound books. William sat behind the massive oak desk where his father had conducted business for 4 decades, feeling like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. Prime Minister Margaret Thorne entered with a stack of documents that needed immediate attention. Constitutional requirements dictated that certain actions be taken within hours of a monarch's death, regardless of the family's grief. The transition of power had to be seamless to maintain stability in the government and the country. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister began, and William visibly flinched at being addressed by his father's title. "I know this is incredibly difficult, but there are several urgent matters that require your immediate attention." The formality of the address created a barrier between William and a woman he had known since childhood. Margaret Thorne had been a family friend long before she became Prime Minister, someone who had attended his birthday parties and graduation ceremonies. Now, protocol demanded a different relationship, one defined by constitutional duty rather than personal affection. Archbishop Davidson joined them, bringing the religious and ceremonial aspects that would govern the coming weeks. The funeral arrangements alone required dozens of decisions, from the order of service to the guest list that would include heads of state from around the world. Every choice would be scrutinized by the media and the public, adding pressure to what should have been private family decisions. "The funeral will likely be held at Westminster Cathedral," the Archbishop explained gently. "Following tradition, we suggest a state funeral with full honors. However, if your Majesty prefers a more private ceremony." "No," William said firmly, finding his voice as the new monarch. "My father served this country for 40 years. He deserves every honor we can give him. The people outside our gates deserve the opportunity to say goodbye properly." As the afternoon progressed, Catherine found herself taking on responsibilities she had never anticipated. Phone calls came from royal families across Europe, expressing condolences and asking about funeral arrangements. Foreign dignitaries needed to be hosted, security arrangements had to be coordinated with multiple countries, and the media requests were endless. The children's routine became paramount in maintaining some normalcy during the chaos. Catherine insisted that Alexander and Isabella keep their regular meal times, nap schedules, and bedtime stories, even as the palace buzzed with activity around them. She personally tucked them in that night, reading an extra story to help them feel secure in a world that suddenly felt uncertain. "Will Daddy still have time to play with us?" Alexander asked as Catherine smoothed his blankets. The question cut straight to her heart, the innocent fear of a child who sensed that something fundamental was changing in his family. "Daddy will always have time for you and Isabella," Catherine promised, though she wondered privately how they would balance the demands of the crown with the needs of their young children. "He loves you very much, and being king doesn't change that." Later that evening, as the last of the official meetings concluded and the palace finally grew quiet, Catherine found William standing alone in his father's study. He was holding a framed photograph of the 3 of them, himself, Catherine, and Edmund, taken just last Christmas. In the picture, they were all laughing at something Isabella had said, their faces bright with joy and love. "I keep thinking I should call him," William said without turning around. "Every major decision I've made as an adult, I've discussed with him first. How am I supposed to do this without his guidance?" Catherine moved to stand beside him, studying the photograph in his hands. "You won't be doing it without his guidance," she said softly. "Everything he taught you, every conversation you had, every lesson he shared, that's all still with you. He prepared you for this your entire life." The palace staff had worked tirelessly throughout the day to accommodate the sudden change in protocol. Rooms that had been the domain of the crown prince were now the king's quarters. Security details were adjusted, communication systems were updated, and the subtle but important changes that marked the transition from heir to sovereign were implemented with remarkable efficiency. Outside, the crowd had thinned somewhat as evening approached, but dedicated mourners remained, some planning to maintain their vigil through the night. Candles began to appear among the flowers, creating a soft glow that could be seen from the palace windows. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to the love the people felt for their departed king and their desire to support the new monarch in his time of grief. As Catherine and William finally retired to their private quarters, They could hear the distant sound of singing from the crowd outside. Someone had begun Amazing Grace, and others had joined in, their voices carrying through the night air with a beauty that brought fresh tears to both their eyes. The first day of William's reign was ending, but the journey ahead stretched out before them like an unknown path. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new grief to navigate. But tonight, they held each other in the darkness and remembered a king who had loved them both like his own children. The morning of King Edmund's funeral dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself was mourning the loss of Aldoria's beloved monarch. Catherine woke before sunrise, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparations, protocol meetings, and private grief that seemed to have no end. She found William already awake, standing by the window, and watching the early preparations in the courtyard below. Military personnel were setting up barriers and checking security positions, while palace staff coordinated with television crews who would broadcast the funeral to millions around the world. The sight of so much activity for such a sorrowful occasion felt surreal. "Did you sleep at all?" Catherine asked softly, wrapping her arms around him from behind. His body was tense with stress and grief that he hadn't had time to properly process. "A little," William replied, though the dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. "I kept thinking about the speech I have to give today. How do you summarize a man's entire life in 10 minutes? How do you tell a nation what kind of father he was when they only knew him as their king?" The speech had been weighing heavily on William's mind for days. Royal protocol dictated that the new monarch address the nation during the funeral service, but the words seemed impossible to find. How could he capture Edmund's warmth, his wisdom, his dedication to duty, and his love for his family in a few formal paragraphs that would be analyzed by every newspaper in the country? The children's voices could be heard in the hallway as Mrs. Harrison helped them prepare for the most difficult day of their young lives. Alexander had been practicing his bow for when he would meet the foreign dignitaries, while Isabella struggled to understand why she had to wear a black dress instead of her favorite pink one. "Mama, why can't I wear my princess dress?" Isabella asked as Catherine helped her with the small black coat that had been hastily tailored for the occasion. "Grandpapa liked my princess dress. Today is a special day to remember Grandpapa," Catherine explained gently, kneeling down to Isabella's level. "We wear black clothes to show that we're sad he's not with us anymore, but also to show how much we loved him." Alexander, trying to be brave like his father, stood quietly as his tie was adjusted, but Catherine could see the confusion and sadness in his eyes. At 5 years old, he was beginning to understand the finality of death, and the weight of that knowledge was visible in his unusually serious expression. The first guests began arriving at Westminster Cathedral before dawn. Heads of state from across Europe, Commonwealth leaders, representatives from the United Nations, and dignitaries from every corner of the globe had traveled to Aldoria to pay their respects. The guest list read like a who's who of international politics, but Catherine knew that for all their titles and importance, they were here to honor a man who had touched lives far beyond the political sphere. Queen Mother Elizabeth, Edmund's widow and William's mother, had been the pillar of strength for the family throughout the week. Despite her own profound grief, she had helped coordinate the service, advised on protocol questions, and provided comfort to her son as he navigated his first week as king. Her grace under pressure reminded Catherine why Edmund had chosen her as his queen so many years ago. She was his greatest love, William had told Catherine one evening as they watched Elizabeth reviewing funeral arrangements with quiet dignity. "Everything good about my childhood came from their partnership. I hope we can be that for each other when we face our own challenges." The cathedral began to fill 2 hours before the service was scheduled to begin. Catherine watched from a private room as ordinary citizens who had won the lottery for public seats took their places alongside world leaders. Nurses from hospitals Edmund had visited, teachers from schools he had supported, volunteers from charities he had championed, they all sat with equal dignity in the ancient cathedral. Among the crowd, Catherine spotted faces she recognized from royal visits over the years. The elderly woman who had given Edmund a bouquet during a visit to her nursing home was there, tears streaming down her face. The young boy who had presented him with a handmade card during a school visit had grown into a teenager, but he still carried the same card, now worn from years of treasuring. The moment Catherine had been dreading finally arrived. The royal family's procession to the cathedral began with a horse-drawn carriage carrying Edmund's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with his crown, orb, and scepter. The sight of those symbols of his reign, which he had worn with such dignity for 40 years, now resting on his coffin, brought fresh tears to her eyes. William walked behind the carriage in full military dress uniform, his face a mask of controlled composure that Catherine knew was costing him tremendous effort to maintain. She followed in a second carriage with the children and Queen Mother Elizabeth, all of them silent as they processed through streets lined with thousands of mourning citizens. The crowd stretched for miles, people standing 10 deep behind barriers, many throwing flowers as the procession passed. Some held photographs of Edmund from his younger days as a prince, others displayed banners with messages of gratitude for his service. The silence was profound, hundreds of thousands of people standing in absolute quiet as their beloved king made his final journey. Alexander held tightly to Catherine's hand throughout the carriage ride, his eyes wide as he took in the enormity of the crowds. "Mama, did all these people love Grandpapa too?" he whispered. "Yes, sweetheart," Catherine whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "He was very special to a lot of people." The service itself was both magnificent and heartbreaking. The cathedral, which had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies, had never felt more solemn. The music, performed by choirs from across the Commonwealth, filled the ancient space with harmonies that seemed to lift the grief toward the vaulted ceiling. When William rose to deliver his eulogy, Catherine held her breath. She could see his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the podium, but his voice was clear and strong as he began to speak. "My father was many things to many people," William began, his eyes finding Catherine's face in the front row. "To this nation, he was a king who served with unwavering dedication for 4 decades. To the Commonwealth, he was a symbol of unity and tradition. To countless charities and organizations, he was a patron who brought attention to their vital work." Catherine watched as William's composure began to crack slightly, the formal words giving way to something more personal and raw. "But, to me, he was simply Dad. The man who taught me to ride a bicycle in the palace gardens, who read me bedtime stories about brave knights and wise kings, who showed me that true nobility comes not from titles or crowns, but from service to others and love for family." The cathedral was absolutely silent except for William's voice, which grew stronger as he continued. "He taught me that being king is not about power or privilege, but about responsibility and sacrifice. He showed me that a crown is heaviest when worn with love for the people it represents." Catherine could see tears in the eyes of hardened diplomats and world leaders who had known Edmund personally. Even the archbishop, who had performed countless funeral services, dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. "My father's legacy will live on not in monuments or history books, but in the example he set for all of us. He showed us how to lead with compassion, how to serve with humility, and how to love without condition. As I take up the crown he wore with such honor, I pray that I can be half the man, half the father, and half the king that he was." When William returned to his seat, Catherine reached for his hand, feeling it tremble in hers. Around them, the congregation was deeply moved, many openly weeping for a king who had been not just a ruler, but a father figure to an entire nation. The committal service at the royal burial ground was smaller, limited to family and close friends. As Edmund's coffin was lowered into the ground beside his parents and grandparents, Catherine felt the full weight of the moment. This was the end of an era, the close of a chapter that had defined their family for 40 years. Little Isabella, who had been quiet throughout the day, suddenly burst into tears as the dirt was thrown onto the coffin. "I want Grandpapa to come back," she cried, her small voice carrying clearly in the still air. Catherine gathered her daughter in her arms, her own tears finally falling freely as the reality of their loss hit with full force. As the family returned to the palace that evening, the building felt different, emptier somehow, despite being full of staff and ongoing activity. The throne room, where Edmund had held audiences and state functions, seemed to echo with memories of his laughter and wisdom. William stood alone in the room for several minutes, looking at the throne that would now be his. Tomorrow, the work of being king would begin in earnest. Tonight, he was simply a son saying goodbye to his father. 3 weeks after the funeral, the palace had settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt nothing like the comfortable routine they had known before. William threw himself into his royal duties with an intensity that worried Catherine. He was awake before dawn reviewing briefing papers, spent long hours in meetings with ministers and advisors, and often worked well past midnight on state correspondence. The transformation was both necessary and heartbreaking to watch. The man she had married, who loved nothing more than playing football in the garden with their children or stealing quiet moments together in their private sitting room, was disappearing beneath the weight of the crown. The playful prince who had once surprised her with impromptu picnics and made her laugh until her sides hurt was being replaced by a monarch who carried the burden of 8 million people on his shoulders. "You need to eat," Catherine said one morning, finding an untouched breakfast tray outside his study door. It was the third meal he had missed in 2 days, and she was genuinely concerned about his health. "I'll eat later," William called from inside the room, his voice distracted. "The trade minister is coming at 9, and I haven't finished reviewing the economic reports yet." Catherine pushed open the door to find William surrounded by papers, his formal shirt wrinkled from sleeping in his chair, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. The sight of him looking so overwhelmed and exhausted broke her heart. "This has to stop," she said firmly, moving to close the file he was reading. "Your father didn't become a good king by destroying his health in the first month of his reign." William looked up at her with eyes that were bloodshot from fatigue and stress. "I don't know how he did it, Catherine. Every decision affects thousands of people. The economic policies I approve today will impact families for years. How do I know if I'm making the right choices?" The vulnerability in his voice reminded Catherine of the scared little boy he must have been when he first understood that he would one day be king. Despite all his preparation, all his education and training, nothing could truly prepare someone for the reality of sovereign responsibility. "You make the best decisions you can with the information you have," Catherine said gently, sitting on the arm of his chair. "And you trust the advisors your father chose, the same people who helped him make good decisions for 40 years. You don't have to carry this burden alone." The children were struggling with the changes in their own ways. Alexander, who had always been close to his father, couldn't understand why Daddy was always working and never had time for their usual games. He had started acting out at lessons, refusing to sit still for his tutors, and asking constantly when his father would come play with him. Isabella, too young to understand the complexities of royal duty, simply missed her grandfather's daily visits and her father's bedtime stories. She had begun having nightmares, waking up crying for people who were no longer available to comfort her in the same way they had before. "The children need their father," Catherine told William one evening when he missed Alexander's soccer match for the 3rd week in a row. "I know being king is important, but they're only little for such a short time. They need to know that they matter to you too." The guilt that flashed across William's face was painful to see. "I know," he said quietly. "I keep telling myself that once I get settled into the role, once I understand the systems better, I'll have more time for them. But every day seems to bring new crises that need immediate attention." Queen Mother Elizabeth had been watching her son struggle with growing concern. One afternoon, she requested a private audience with Catherine in the Queen's garden, a space that had been Edmund's favorite place for informal conversations. "He's trying to be perfect," Elizabeth said as they walked among the roses that Edmund had lovingly tended. "He thinks that if he works hard enough, learns fast enough, and dedicates every waking moment to duty, he can fill the void that his father's death created. But that's not how it works." Catherine had always admired her mother-in-law's wisdom, but today she seemed particularly insightful. "How did you and Edmund manage it? How did you balance being monarchs with being parents and partners?" Elizabeth smiled sadly, touching a pink rose that had been Edmund's favorite variety. "We made mistakes. Many of them. There were times when duty demanded so much that we lost sight of what really mattered. But we learned that a good king is not someone who sacrifices everything for the crown. A good king is someone who understands that his greatest strength comes from the love and support of his family." The conversation gave Catherine an idea. That evening, she did something unprecedented. She dismissed William's evening appointments and asked the kitchen to prepare a simple family dinner. When William protested that he had important calls to make, she simply took the phone from his hands and turned it off. "Tonight, you're not the king," she announced firmly. "Tonight, you're just Daddy and my husband. The kingdom will survive one evening without your attention." The dinner was the first time in weeks that the family had eaten together without interruption. Alexander chatted excitedly about a butterfly he had found in the garden, while Isabella showed off her new ability to eat with a fork instead of her fingers. For an hour, they were just a normal family sharing a meal and enjoying each other's company. William seemed to relax for the first time since his father's death, laughing at his children's stories and asking Catherine about her day. The transformation was remarkable. The stressed, overwhelmed monarch disappeared, replaced by the loving father and husband she had fallen in love with. After the children were in bed, Catherine and William sat together in their private sitting room for the first time in weeks. The space felt almost foreign after being used for so long. But gradually the familiar comfort of their shared sanctuary began to work its magic. "I feel like I'm failing at everything," William admitted quietly. "I'm not the king my father was. I'm not the husband you deserve. And I'm certainly not the father our children need right now." Catherine turned to face him fully, taking his hands in hers. "You're not your father, and you don't need to be. Edmund became a great king over 40 years, not 40 days. He made mistakes, he learned, he grew into the role. You will too. But only if you don't burn yourself out trying to be perfect from day one." The conversation marked a turning point. Over the following days, William began to make small but significant changes to his schedule. He started having breakfast with the family again, reading bedtime stories to the children when possible, and setting aside Sunday afternoons for family time that could not be interrupted except for true emergencies. The changes weren't easy. There were still days when duty demanded sacrifices, when important decisions couldn't wait, when the weight of the crown felt almost unbearable. But gradually, William began to understand what his father had known, that being a good king required not just dedication to duty, but also the strength that comes from love, family, and personal happiness. 1 month after Edmund's funeral, William made his first official state visit as king, traveling to neighboring Valeria to meet with their president about trade agreements. Catherine accompanied him, their first joint royal engagement since the coronation that felt like a lifetime ago. Standing beside William as he addressed the Valerian parliament, Catherine saw glimpses of the king he was becoming. Not a copy of his father, but his own version of leadership, younger, perhaps more informal, but with the same underlying dedication to service and care for people. The crowd's response was warm and enthusiastic. They could see that this young king, despite his grief and the enormous pressure of his new role, genuinely cared about their concerns and was committed to building positive relationships between their nations. As their plane lifted off from Valeria for the journey home, William reached for Catherine's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For reminding me that being king doesn't mean I have to stop being human. For making me remember that our children need a father, not just a monarch living in their house. For being patient with me while I figure out how to do this." Catherine squeezed his hand, feeling hopeful for the first time since Edmund's death. They had a long road ahead, years of learning and growing into their roles, but they would travel it together. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would find their own way to honor Edmund's legacy while building something new and uniquely their own. 6 months had passed since King Edmund's death, and the seasons had changed from the gray winter of mourning to a hopeful spring that seemed to mirror the royal family's gradual healing. The palace gardens were blooming with the flowers that Edmund had planted over the years, creating a living memorial to his love of beauty and growth. Catherine stood at the window of the nursery, watching Alexander and Isabella play in the garden below. Their laughter carried on the warm air, a sound that had been missing for too long after their grandfather's death. Alexander was teaching Isabella how to play the game that Edmund had invented for him, a combination of hide and seek and treasure hunt that involved finding small toys hidden among the flower beds. "They're happy again," William said, joining her at the window. His appearance had improved dramatically over the past few months. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and he had regained the healthy color that stress and grief had stolen from his face. "So are you," Catherine observed, studying her husband's profile. The overwhelming panic that had characterized his first weeks as king had been replaced by a quiet confidence that suited him well. He was learning to trust his instincts and the experienced advisors who had served his father faithfully. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been setbacks, days when the pressure seemed unbearable, nights when William woke up in a cold sweat worried about decisions he had made or problems he couldn't solve. But gradually, with Catherine's support and Queen Mother Elizabeth's wisdom, he had found his footing as a monarch. "The memorial garden is almost finished," William said, referring to the project that had become his first major initiative as king. Instead of a traditional statue or monument, he had decided to create a public garden where families could come to remember loved ones they had lost. It would be Edmund's memorial, but also a place of comfort for anyone dealing with grief. The idea had come to him during one of his conversations with citizens who had written letters of condolence after Edmund's death. So many of them had shared their own stories of loss, their own struggles with grief, that William realized his father's death could become an opportunity to help others facing similar pain. "The gardeners planted the last of the roses yesterday," Catherine said. "Your father would have loved knowing that his memorial would help flowers grow instead of just standing as cold stone." The children's voices grew louder as they discovered one of the hidden treasures in their game. Isabella's delighted squeal when she found a small stuffed rabbit brought smiles to both their parents' faces. The sound of pure joy was precious after the months of sadness that had filled the palace. Queen Mother Elizabeth appeared in the garden below, moving slowly but deliberately toward her grandchildren. At 78, she had aged visibly since Edmund's death, but she had channeled her grief into devotion to her family and her role as the children's primary grandparent. "She's been such a gift to us," Catherine said, watching as Elizabeth sat on a garden bench and gathered both children onto her lap for story time. "I don't know how we would have managed without her guidance." Elizabeth had indeed been instrumental in helping William find his way as king. Her years as queen consort had given her insights into the balance between public duty and private life that no textbook could have provided. More importantly, she understood the unique loneliness that came with the crown and had helped William develop strategies for staying connected to his humanity while serving his country. The afternoon brought news that would have once sent William into a spiral of anxiety, but now seemed manageable. A trade dispute with a neighboring country required delicate diplomatic negotiations, and the Prime Minister was requesting an immediate meeting to discuss the king's role in resolving the conflict. 6 months ago, you would have been awake all night worrying about this, Catherine observed as William calmly reviewed the briefing papers. 6 months ago, I thought I had to solve every problem personally and perfectly, William replied with a slight smile. I've learned that sometimes the best thing a king can do is trust the experts he employs and support them in doing their jobs well. The confidence in his voice was genuine. William had discovered that his role was less about having all the answers and more about asking the right questions, bringing people together, and providing the moral leadership that helped others find solutions to complex problems. That evening, the family attended the opening of Edmund's memorial garden. The event was smaller and more intimate than a traditional royal ceremony, reflecting William's desire to make the space feel welcoming to ordinary citizens rather than formal and intimidating. Hundreds of people had come to the opening, many carrying flowers or small mementos. Catherine was deeply moved by the diversity of the crowd. Elderly people who had lived through Edmund's entire reign, young families with small children, teenagers who had barely known the late king, but had been touched by his legacy of service. William's speech was brief and heartfelt, focusing not on grand proclamations but on the simple human need for places of comfort and remembrance. As he spoke, Catherine could see how much he had grown into his role, how naturally leadership came to him when he stopped trying to be someone else. My father believed that a garden was a place of hope, William said, addressing the crowd gathered among the newly planted flowers. Even in winter, even when everything looks dead and barren, a good gardener knows that spring will come again. Life will return, beauty will bloom, and the cycle of growth will continue. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone present. The garden was about more than remembering Edmund. It was about the cycle of life and death, the way love continues even after loss, the possibility of finding beauty again after experiencing profound sadness. Alexander and Isabella were allowed to help officially open the garden by cutting a ribbon stretched between 2 rose bushes. Their excitement at being part of such an important ceremony was infectious, and their genuine joy brought smiles to faces throughout the crowd. As the guests wandered through the garden paths, Catherine found herself in conversation with an elderly woman named Margaret who had traveled from the countryside for the opening. King Edmund visited our village hospital when my grandson was born with heart problems, Margaret explained, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He spent 20 minutes talking with our family, asking about the baby, encouraging us to stay hopeful. My grandson is 15 now and completely healthy, but I'll never forget how the king made time for one scared grandmother. Stories like Margaret's were common throughout the evening. Person after person approached Catherine and William to share memories of how Edmund had touched their lives, through hospital visits, charity work, or simply by being a steady, reassuring presence during difficult times in the country's history. He would have been so proud of what you've created here, Queen Mother Elizabeth told William as the evening wound down. Not just the garden itself, but the way you've brought people together to celebrate life instead of just mourning death. The comment meant everything to William, who still sometimes wondered if he was living up to his father's legacy. Elizabeth's approval was precious not just because she had been Edmund's wife, but because she had been his closest advisor and understood better than anyone what kind of king he had been. As the family returned to the palace that night, Catherine felt a deep sense of peace that had been absent since Edmund's death. The children fell asleep in the car, exhausted from their big day, while William held her hand and watched the countryside pass by in the moonlight. "I think we're going to be okay," William said quietly, speaking the words they had both been afraid to voice for months. "More than okay," Catherine replied, squeezing his hand. "I think we're going to be exactly what this country needs." The palace seemed different when they arrived home, still grand and formal, but no longer oppressive with grief and uncertainty. It felt like a home again, a place where a family lived and loved and grew together, despite the enormous responsibilities that came with their roles. In the years that followed, people would remember the memorial garden opening as the moment when King William truly began his reign. Not the formal coronation that would come later, not the constitutional ceremonies that marked the legal transfer of power, but the evening when a young king showed his people that leadership could be both strong and compassionate. That tradition could evolve while maintaining its essential heart. As Catherine tucked their children into bed that night, she whispered a quiet thank you to Edmund's memory. His death had brought tremendous pain, but it had also brought growth, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of what really mattered in life. The crown would always be heavy, but they had learned to share its weight. The palace would always be public, but they had found ways to preserve their private joy. And the future, which had once seemed overwhelming and uncertain, now stretched ahead with promise and hope. In the garden below their window, night-blooming jasmine filled the air with sweet fragrance, and somewhere in the darkness, the flowers that would honor Edmund's memory continued to grow.